welcome to Red Ice Creations Radio. This is Henrik Palmgren and we are recording from the west coast of Sweden. Thank you for tuning in. It's good to have you here. We're up for an interesting program today. As you know, the website is redicecreations.com. News, forum, radio archive, member section, film, newsletter and much more. So do take a look, and if you like what we do here, help spread the word and tell your friends. Alright, in my hand I hold a copy of a very interesting book. It's called Our Gods Wear Spandex, The Secret History of Comic Book Heroes. This is a fascinating book tracing the origins of the comic book heroes all the way back to the ancient world, the ancient mythologies, and tracks it through history, how it has developed. It also discusses how many actually secret societies have been instrumental in making the comic book genre a reality. The book is a little bit like an encyclopedia almost of some of the most important people, not only within the comic book industry, writers and illustrators, but also people that have been influential within the occult, that have kind of helped to spawn this genre of comic books. We're going to talk about this and much more today with the author, Christopher Knowles. We have with us on the line. By the way, I want to mention that the book is illustrated by Joseph Michael Linzer. Beautiful illustrations that go with the symbolism all the way, you know, superheroes with the square and the compass and the Kabbalah on their chests is beautifully illustrated. Chris Knowles is with us, and I also want to mention his blog that you can check out here during our talk, secretsun.blogspot.com, and that will get you right to his blog, so you can check out more on that. All right, welcome to the program, Christopher Knowles. Wonderful to have you here.
Oh, it's a great pleasure, Henrik. I'm a big fan of your show and a big fan of your work.
Excellent, thank you. You know, to set the tone for our program here today, to get an idea what we're talking about, I want to read 2 paragraphs from your book, Our Gods Wear Spandex. Although most of us don't realize it, there's simply nothing new about devotion to superheroes. Their powers, their costumes, and sometimes even their names are plucked straight from the pre-Christian religion of antiquity. When you go back and look at these heroes in the original incarnations, you can't help but be struck by how blatant their symbolism is and how strongly they reflect the belief system of the pagan age. What even fewer people realize is that this didn't occur by chance, but came directly out of the spiritual and mystical secret societies and cults of the late 19th century. Groups like the Theosophists, the Rosicrucians, and the Golden Dawn. These groups turned their backs on the state cult of Christianity and reached back in time to the elemental deities of the ancient traditions, inspired by the same cultural and spiritual ferment that afflicts us in our post-9/11 world. Artists and architects of this neoclassical movement portrayed the gods and beliefs of the ancient world in works that survive today in the major cities of the West. In Manhattan alone we find Mercury, messenger of the gods, at Grand Central Station. We see Isis, queen of heaven and star of the sea, at the Statue of Liberty, and a whole host of images and symbols of ancient gods at Rockefeller Center. The young artist who created the great superheroes grew up immersed in this atmosphere. All over the finest neighborhoods in Manhattan you find gods lurking everywhere, in lobbies or doorways, in elevators and on rooftops. These young artists, city kids really, looted the treasures of the ancient world from art schools and museums to create our new gods. Yeah, there's a passage there from the new book by Christopher Knowles, Our Gods Wear Spandex. And Christopher, I gotta say, going through your book, you quickly discover that you have a very comprehensive and detailed knowledge of how the comic book industry came to be, how it has developed, and what some of the most influential people working within it has been. And I'd love to know a little bit about your background in comics, if you will.
Well, first of all, I just want to say what an amazing synchronicity is that you chose that passage to open our talk with, because that's something that I'm in the midst of exploring even deeper now. How New York City really was such a powerful influence on the development of these heroes. I actually worked in New York as an artist. I worked in the Empire State Building for several years, which is actually a giant obelisk on 33rd Street, so the symbolism there is kind of unmistakable. I don't know if any of your listeners have been to the Empire State Building, but the minute you walk in the lobby, you see a giant relief on the wall of the Empire State Building as an obelisk, with the rays of the sun coming from the tip of the building. I mean, the symbolism there is so clear, it's so unmistakable.
Yeah.
And by walking around the city, I sort of had the experience that the kids who invented comics in the first place had. These were kids who lived in ethnic enclaves or ghettos in the early part of the 20th century and were amazed by the wealth and power that they saw, particularly in Midtown Manhattan, stretching from the Empire State Building over to the Chrysler Building, the Grand Central Station. I mean, these neighborhoods, which I've walked through personally for many, many years, when I was working in New York and then when I was working as a freelancer, drawing superheroes, drawing cartoons, all these kinds of things. I relived this experience. It was an amazing thing for me to have drawn upon.
Mm-hmm.
And I could bring that to the book. But when I was walking around these neighborhoods, everywhere you went, you could not, you couldn't avoid being confronted with these symbols everywhere. This all came out of the neoclassical movement, as you said in the excerpt of the book. And I really believe that the engine behind the neoclassical movement was groups like the Golden Dawn, like the Theosophical Society, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, that really looked for an answer to the existential crisis of the industrial age by the discovery of ancient texts, the Hermetic texts. You had the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, and all of a sudden all the Egyptian texts were being transcribed for the first time ever. You had the discovery of King Tut's tomb, which I think was very, very powerful influence on the origin of comics, because so many characters, to the name Hawkman and Dr. Fate, very popular characters of the golden age of comics, very clearly drew upon the King Tut's tomb mythos. So what you had was this conjunction of events in history where you had massive immigration to the New World, you had the Great Depression and the oncoming of World War II, and then you had the remnants of this amazing pagan revival that took place in the late 19th century. So this is something I've been thinking very much about, how the city itself was a huge influence, because the city, Manhattan, Midtown Manhattan, is almost like a pagan temple. If you are familiar with the symbolism, if you're familiar with the language, because symbolism is a language, if you're familiar with that, you can't help but see this everywhere you go in Manhattan. Rockefeller Center is it's an amazing example of this. You have that statue of Prometheus, which I believe is Mithras, because you have him rising from the rock, holding the flame, and surrounded by the zodiac. I mean, there's no mention of the zodiac in the stories of Prometheus. I mean, that's Mithras. So, not to be long-winded about this, but it's very exciting to me that you brought that up.
Yeah, excellent.
Synchronicity.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And I, want to just interject here. I mean, New York, after all, New York City in New York is called the Big Apples. I mean, to some extent, we couldn't get more, I guess, in tune to the, maybe not the pagan world, but at least that there is a hint that there is some kind of hidden knowledge there. Again, going back to the story of, the Adam and Eve in the garden, basically.
Yeah, and the golden apples of the sun, things like that. I mean, there's a lot of symbolism, the fruit of the tree of knowledge, Noxus. I mean, there's a lot of symbols that tie into that. But if you can just perhaps go on the web and sort of poke around, look at Grand Central Station, the main lobby, you have the constellations on the sky. I mean, you have the giant relief of Mercury and his attendants on the side facing Madison Avenue. It's just amazing. When you know the language, it speaks to you. And the way I look at it is that I don't see this as some sort of literal paganism where you're animist nature worship. To me, there's a revival of the high pagan ideal, or the high pre-Christian, or the high Gnostic ideal, the high Neoplatonic ideal of the language of symbols.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. We definitely want to talk more about that later on and get into that and see what some of these characters behind this also could be, of course, and how this is connected, with many secret societies and also, Freemasonry and so forth. But before we go there, I just want to mention, the cover of your book is amazing. I mean, it's very nice. The Last Supper. Tell us about it and how you guys came up with this particular image.
Well, I've got to give full credit to Joseph Michael Lenzner, a good friend of mine, an amazing artist. That was his concept, that was his idea, and he executed it beautifully. I wanted something that would show how comic book superheroes have become the new mythology. Joseph Campbell once said that modern culture had no real mythology, and I always, having learned to read at the age of 3 by reading comics, I always thought this was sort of absurd, because I always saw superheroes as being our mythology. I mean, the greatest example of this is during World War II, when superheroes were very much part of the war effort. They were mascots.
Yeah.
And there's no clearer example of mythology than that, than a GI walking around with a bunch of Superman comics in his duffel bag. So Joe took that ball and ran with it and came up with that beautiful image, iconic image, I think.
Yeah.
And, he was also referring, to the whole Da Vinci Code mythos, and the things we know about Leonardo and his involvement with secret societies and his involvement with just hidden knowledge.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. And again, it references that idea that you discuss throughout the book, that it's a bit of a retelling in some instances of the Christ story, but also kind of I guess a replacement of it. And we're certainly going to get into that. What I want to ask you... I
wouldn't say necessarily a replacement. I think that's a bit loaded, but it's a replaying, or a reimagining.
A retelling of the story?
Yeah, I think so. I think that a lot of the same impulses. If you look at the 1930s and you look at what was going on in the culture then, it's in a lot of ways it's similar to first century Palestine. You had a lot of chaos and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear about the future in both eras, and that's when these Messiah archetypes will emerge. This need for a savior figure, and I think that that's something that ties both time periods together really well.
Interesting. What we have to talk about here is how you came to kind of discover this undercurrent or other stream of information that kind of led you into studying the ancient mysteries or mythologies and even the occult. When did your eyes kind of first open to this, or have you always been steeped in this, considered your background in comics?
Well, exactly. I mean, reading comics from a very early age, you can't avoid this material. One of the comics, my uncles had a lot of comics, and I'd go to my grandmother's house and I'd read their comics. And I remember seeing one comic, an advertisement for a comic that I wouldn't see till much later, and it was called The New Gods. And it was this series that just inculcated itself into my imagination. But that was really drawn upon the Norse pantheon of Mighty Thor is a very popular comic character in America. And that was one of my favorites. I mean, I